Hello, and welcome back to the Gaily Digest. I'm Nigel, and as always, I'm joined by
Joshua.
And today we're going to be doing something really important. Now, this is going to be a special episode where we're going to be talking about World AIDS Day. World AIDS Day is an annual event, and it's held on the 1st of December every year, and it has been since 1988. We are now on to the 37th World AIDS Day, and it's always a time for us to help raise awareness about HIV and AIDS. Remember the lives lost and to support those living with HIV today. It's been over 40 years since the HIV epidemic began, and whilst we've made incredible progress, there's still a lot of work to do, especially when it comes to fighting stigma and ensuring that everyone has access to treatment.
Exactly. Today, we'll look at how the HIV epidemic started, where we are now, and what the future holds. It's a story of loss, resilience, and hope. So let's get started.
So let's start by looking at some facts. There are approximately 38 million people living with HIV globally. In the UK alone, there are 105,000 people who live with HIV. 98% of those that are diagnosed are on effective treatment. Now, whilst we understand those are today's facts, it's quite important for us to look back on how the HIV epidemic started, how HIV was identified, and how different it was for people living with HIV than it is now.
The HIV epidemic began in the early 1980s. In 1981, doctors in Los Angeles saw cases of a rare pneumonia in young, healthy men. At first, the illness was called gay-related immune deficiency, often referred to as GRID, because it mostly affected gay men. This name added to the stigma and the misinformation. In 1983, scientists discovered the virus and named it human immunodeficiency virus, also known as HIV. They also learned it could affect anyone, not just gay men.
Exactly. And by the late 1980s, millions of people were infected, and AIDS-related deaths were rising. The condition damaged the immune system, leaving people vulnerable to infections. And the epidemic, as it broke out in the late 1980s, eventually became immortalised in the drama series by Russell T Davies, It's a Sin, which followed a group of gay men that were living through the HIV epidemic. And I think I watched that show, I watched that series, and there were lots of times when I didn't have a dry eye. There were lots of times when I got very emotional because I thought it was so well done, it was so well written, and it highlighted a lot of the stigma that was around during the time. I mean, there's still a fair bit of stigma today, which we still need to stamp out, but it highlighted, I think, how people could get infected, how people could contract the virus, and how people didn't talk about it because there was a sense of shame, there was a sense of embarrassment. Families didn't talk about it. They would lie to people that they knew if a loved one had contracted it, and it just highlighted how much ignorance there was and how much of a lack of education there was around HIV. And I think that sort of makes it quite key that activism was quite key to change. There were groups like ACT UP that demanded more research and better access to care and affordable treatments. They had protests and campaigns like Silence Equals Death, and they were quite groundbreaking. And talking of groundbreaking, there was that very important moment in 1987 where Princess Diana broke down barriers. She visited a hospital where there were people that were living with HIV and AIDS, she rather famously shook hands with them without using personal protection equipment, without using gloves or anything like that. And that was quite groundbreaking in itself. I mean, Josh, Diana's handshake became a symbol of compassion. Why do you think it has such a lasting impact?
Well, I think that there was an incredible amount of misinformation back then. People thought that you could catch it from a simple, like breezing against someone, even being in the room with them, touching their hand, a peck on the cheeks, things like that. They believed you could just catch it then and you'd die within a week, kind of thing, because that's what was good. Because there wasn't an education, nobody was putting it out there, the facts. It just bred this misinformation going around everywhere.
I think, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of lack of information as well, which I think probably contributed to the misinformation that was out there, because people would have started just making stuff up about how it could be spread or contracted, and where there's a lack of information, people try to fill those gaps, um, and that is part of the problem, and that's why there were. I think also because it became wrongly attributed to the gay community, in particular gay men, I think that's why people didn't want to know about it as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of people swept it under the rug because it's kind of like it's affecting them people, it doesn't affect us. So let's just leave them to suffer and pay the consequences.
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of headlines as well. I think in the 80s, talking about it being the gay virus, the gay disease, and um, I seem to remember talk of it only affects us, leave them to it, sort of thing, and and that just added to the homophobia as well in the 1980s.
Well, that kind of language and those kind of headlines also puts other people at such a high risk because they presumed that only gay men could catch it, which we will later find out that that's not how it works. Anybody can catch it. Doesn't matter on your gender, your race, sexuality, or anything. So this is putting people who aren't gay at risk because they think that it's not going to get them. They don't need to use protection and things because it only affects gay people, and then that's going to cause a spike in people catching it and not realizing and it being overlooked.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, certainly a lack of education, lack of information, and ignorance as well would lead to an increase in diagnoses going forward.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth noting, jumping back to Diana again, she didn't just do this once as a one-off.
No,
That one does
times.
stick in your mind a lot because it was the first time and it was such an important message. But she also did it in New York in 1989. She hugged a 7-year-old boy who had it. And then she again in 1991 she went to Brazil and visited a hostel for children that had been abandoned, and they had HIV and AIDS, and she was playing with them and just having contact with them and seeing them as children and not just discarded because of them suffering from this disease.
And I think for someone in such a prominent public position, such a prominent public figure as well, to do something like that, to show the world, because the world would have been watching. The world would have been watching her doing that. And for her to break down those barriers and show the world that I have faith in this, I am confident that it is not spread through touching or hugging or close contact. She literally, I think for a lot of gay men out there, I think she changed the world for them.
She humanized them.
Yes, absolutely, 100%. Because people shouldn't be defined by what they are, who they are, where they are, or where they're from. And, they shouldn't be defined by their HIV diagnosis either, because that's not what defines them as a person, and it never should.
We're talking about the 1980s. Obviously, you grew up during that time. What do you think it was like to live during the time of HIV while it was misunderstood, especially before effective treatments were even available?
It's a good question, because, I mean, yes, I grew up in the 1980s. I was very young during the 1980s, but that said, even though I was so young, I do remember key things about the HIV epidemic. I remember seeing adverts on the television. I remember them being so dark. I mean, the one that stands out in my mind is the one with the tombstone with the word AIDS being chiseled into it. And I remember seeing it and thinking, what is that? And it just seemed so frightening to me. And it was almost like there was a lot of scare tactic around it, with no real education, no real information that could garner any support for people that contracted it and that were starting to live with it, and experience the illnesses that came with it. I also remember an occasion when I was out with family at a pub, and there was a group of others that were with us, and we were all part of this big group. And there was a husband and wife that were leaving. The husband was saying his goodbyes and kissed one of the other ladies on the cheek. His wife just turned around and said, "Oh, mind you don't catch AIDS." And I remember the shock on people's faces, and the people that were with us, almost the disgust at the suggestion of saying something like that. And I never really understood it until now. Obviously, I can look back, but it always sticks in my mind that was what it, that it was such a big talking point. It was such a big thing in the 80s. And I do know of people that have lived through it, and certainly that with the lack of education that there was, particularly when Section 28 was brought in by Margaret Thatcher and her government, that there was no education out there to be able to explain to people what HIV was, how you could contract it, how it spread, measures that you could take to reduce or prevent contracting HIV. And it wasn't until 1987, I think, that there was the first HIV treatment, azithromycin, I believe it's called, otherwise known as AZT, which was the first treatment that was known. It was expensive. It had very harsh side effects, but it did give hope to a community that was losing people, and losing people so quickly and so suddenly as well. I mean, we talked about the drama series It's a Sin that immortalised what it was like for a community, for a group of friends, to experiencing losing people. And that was a drama series that was written by Russell T Davies, and I think he dealt with the subject matter very delicately, very sensitively, and I thought, other than being a drama series, I think it also served to be quite educational, because I think, like with Princess Diana, I think it helped to break down barriers.
I personally think that show should be shown in schools. I think it is an incredibly powerful and important show that really does educate you, and it shows that we can't go back to how things used to be. I do genuinely believe that should be shown
part of a curriculum.
Definitely in secondary schools, I think it should be part of sex education.
Yeah, I agree with that. Did you know that It's a Sin was actually inspired on a true life story regarding a particular individual?
Oh, I didn't.
There was an actor in the 1980s called Dursley McClendon.
Mm.
He grew up on the Isle of Man, not the Isle of Wight that was featured in the show. He was a young gay man that went into acting, much like Richie Tozer did in It's a Sin. And he became diagnosed with HIV. Sadly, he died at the age of 30, and his death was attributed to AIDS. But yeah, It's a Sin was based upon his story, obviously with certain things changed out of respect for him. But yeah, that's what It's a Sin was based upon.
Let's talk about where we are today. HIV is no longer a death sentence. Antiretroviral therapy, also known as ART, allows people with HIV to live long, healthy lives. If treated effectively, the virus can become so low in the body that it's undetectable. This means it cannot be passed on to others. This is known as undetectable equals untransmittable, or U equals U. And speaking of this, today actually, I had a conversation with somebody who mentioned that they had a relative that's just been diagnosed with HIV. And they said that it's a shame because they can no longer have children because the children will get it. They can't get a partner because they'll pass it on to them, and that they're probably going to not live very long. And unfortunately, this misinformation and a bit of ignorance is still around today. So I let them know that as long as they're on their medication, they will be undetectable. They could have a baby and it wouldn't be passed on. They could have sex with their partners, they wouldn't pass it on. They could live a life just as healthy as us as long as they're on the treatment. And they were so shocked that that was a thing. They didn't understand any of it. They didn't know that you could have medication and it be like you can't pass it on. They just didn't understand that.
I think again, that, like you say, it highlights the ignorance. It highlights the lack of education, and it's shocking that in 2024 we are still having to have those conversations with people. Not as many people, I think, but I think there are still a few out there that are ignorant to the facts and either don't want to learn or just can't be bothered to learn.
There's still unfortunately, a lot of people from our own community that don't understand undetectable means untransmittable. Even people within our own groups do not understand this, and they will shun people that have HIV and will not even talk to them because they just don't understand that they can't catch it.
You see, I think that's terrible. I can't imagine not wanting to talk to someone or shunning someone just because of their HIV diagnosis. I mean, we know people that we're friends with that have HIV. I wouldn't dream of cutting them out or cutting them off or leaving them.
Well, they've said when they told us that they waited months after knowing us to tell us because they were scared to say. And that does really hurt because they shouldn't have to feel that way.
Exactly. And I think that just highlights how people living with it probably still feel a sense of shame when they shouldn't have to, just because of ignorance that's out there and a lack of education. The important thing is to educate people and to show that regardless of your HIV status, you are still a valuable person. You're still valued. You're still respected. You're still loved, and you're still thought highly of. Because what matters is you as the person, and that's what should matter. I mean, let's look back at where we are today. As you've said, Josh, you equals you, and it is important that people understand that and people learn that and people know that. Globally, AIDS-related deaths have dropped by about 68% since 2004, which is a massive feat.
It's astounding.
That's a good success rate. Obviously, we want it to be a lot higher. We want it to be 100%. But there are still challenges that remain, and there's millions in low-income countries that don't have access to treatment. They don't get that treatment on the NHS. They don't get that treatment. It's expensive treatment for them, and they can't get it. There are some groups like young women in sub-Saharan Africa that are at higher risk. Stigma continues to affect people living with HIV. For example, in the UK, 1 in 3 people with HIV say they've faced discrimination, and they shouldn't. They absolutely shouldn't. But again, that goes back to what we were just saying about a lack of education and a lack of understanding around HIV and medication they can receive, treatments, and so forth. But that's where we go down to the point of education. Education is crucial, as is testing. There are still a lot of people out there that don't know their status, which is why raising awareness is so important.
And what I find so incredible nowadays is you could literally pop down to your local chemist and you could get a HIV test and have it done within 15 minutes. You could have them ordered from Terence Higgins, which is, I think it's about £15. They'll send it to your home. You can do a quick finger prick test, or you can do a little swab in your mouth if you don't like to do finger pricks, and you'll get a result. And you haven't even got to leave your house. And the money that you pay for that towards Terence Higgins goes towards them helping raise awareness and helping those in need who are living with HIV.
So, talking about people living with HIV today, Josh, what would you say is the most important thing people should know about living with HIV today?
Now, I think some of the most important things is that if you're on treatment, you can live a long and healthy life. And if you're undetectable, you can't pass it on. And I think they should remember that the biggest battle is actually against stigma and not the actual virus itself. And speaking of stigma, why do you think it's still such a big issue, even with the progress that we've made?
Ignorance, lack of education, and the media, I would say. I think they've all got a part to play in why there's still stigma, despite the progress that we've made. Lack of education, because it's not something that's talked about enough. It's not something that people want to talk about either, I think. But again, there's also the media. I mean, I'm going to read a segment from a book that I have in my hand. It's a book called First Time by Nathaniel Hall, who he was actually in It's a Sin as well. Nathaniel is he's an actor. He's also an activist, a HIV activist. And I'm going to read a bit from his book, which is the context part of his book, where he talks about, or he makes reference to, HIV healthcare has changed, but people's knowledge of the virus and attitudes towards those living with it still lag behind. HIV is treatable, as we've mentioned. People on successful treatment cannot pass on the virus. And in 2018, the UK became the first Western nation to meet the UN's targets on reducing infections. Cities across the UK are also signing up to become HIV fast-track cities, committing to reducing new transmissions to 0 by 2030. And with the introduction of PrEP, more people on effective treatment and better HIV health campaigns, leading HIV charities believe that we now have the tools to end HIV in a generation. But there are thousands of people with HIV across the country who live in fear of people finding out. And this goes back to the shame that we've talked about. Recently, several media outlets claimed a man risked his life having sex with his HIV-positive girlfriend so they can have a baby, when there is in fact no risk, as she was on effective treatment. Therefore, she was undetectable, so she was untransmissible. In 2016, the Daily Mail ran a front-page headline claiming that HIV medication was a £5,000 lifestyle drug, implying that money shouldn't be spent on preventing people getting HIV other than other life-saving interventions such as statins for older people. Sadly, worrying and stigmatising headlines like this aren't uncommon. They add fuel to the fire that people with HIV are a danger to others, which contributes to the culture of fear that stops people getting tested regularly. And First Time, which is his book, aims to educate, destigmatise and empower, in turn contributing to the aim of ending all new transmissions of HIV by 2030. Now, Nathaniel's book, First Time, is a memoir about his journey of living with HIV. Starting from his diagnosis at a young age, it reflects on the challenges of coming out, dealing with stigma, and finding resilience in the face of adversity, all while offering an honest and humorous look at his experiences as a gay man living with HIV. I would recommend it. I would suggest that people try and get a copy of it. I believe you can get it on Amazon, both as a Kindle and as a paperback. It's First Time by Nathaniel Hall. Please do go out there, make the effort to get it and to give it a read as well, because I think it's certainly something that will help with raising awareness and understanding, not just for those living with HIV, but also for others around people that they know that are living with HIV, because it can help educate them as well. So where are we looking at the future of HIV and AIDS? There are significant advances in science, which are promising. There's even been rare cases of people being cured. I mean, look at the Berlin patient, for example. The Berlin patient was described, I think it was 1998, as exhibiting prolonged post-treatment control of an HIV viral load after HIV treatments were interrupted. The phrase Berlin patient was later used to preserve the anonymity of the individual, although that individual did later come forward and make his name public as Timothy Ray Brown. And that was made public in the late 2010, I think it was. Also, there was a London patient, similar circumstances, that was 11 years later. So advances in science are helping to make this possible. There's also researchers working on vaccines, including using some mRNA technology similar to COVID vaccines, and look at how, when the COVID vaccine rollout happened, how infection rates for COVID lowered and it was able to be a bit better controlled. I mean, Joshua, do you think we'll see a vaccine or cure in our lifetime?
Well, I think, as you mentioned, the COVID vaccine, if you look at how the world literally came together during that, and they all put money in, all the scientists shared their work, look how fast we got these treatments and these vaccines. It was like an unprecedented speed. So imagine if all these scientists worked together, came together, the money was put into it. Especially back then, if they would have took it seriously and put all this money into it and worked together, we could have that now. But unfortunately, we don't yet. But we do have treatments like PrEP and PEP, which we didn't have back then. And talking of PrEP, I did myself several years ago. I was on PrEP, and it was very difficult to get hold of. You had to jump through many loops, and you had to fit all this criteria. It was only in certain areas. I had to travel about 40 minutes to go to this specific place to get it. So there's a lot of issues still now with those medications, and eventually you could get it from your GP. And I went to my GP and I said, could you put me on PrEP on prescription? I'm on it with this clinic, but I can get it from you now. Could you prescribe it me? And straight away she just said, oh, do you have HIV then? And I was like, no, why would you think that? And she went, oh, well, you're on HIV medication. She genuinely didn't know what PrEP was. She didn't know what it was for. She didn't understand it at all. She didn't even know if she could prescribe it. I had to actually educate my own doctor on what PrEP is and what it's for. And it's for the preventative treatment of getting HIV rather than treating if you've got it.
It's quite shocking that you had to educate your own doctor on that.
exactly. So yeah, the UN aims to end AIDS by 2030, but I think it's probably a good time to mention that a more preferred term now is advanced HIV. And this is because it's a less stigmatized term than AIDS, because there's a lot of ignorance around that term. But what do you think needs to happen with the UN to reach this goal of 2030?
Well, I think simply there needs to be more funding for treatment. There needs to be more education. And I think we need to come together, and there needs to be a global effort to fight the stigma and make the treatment accessible for all. Um, I mean, you mentioned how the world come together for COVID and how quickly we got that under control. Um, but why can't we do it for HIV or advanced HIV? Um, is that because of the stigma that's attached to it? Probably. I think probably so. But yeah, that's what I think that needs to happen for the UN to reach its goal by that time. We just need to come together, fight the stigma, educate, and make sure that treatment is available for everyone and it's more easily accessible. So as we wrap up, let's take a moment to remember those that we have lost to AIDS and to celebrate the strength of those living with HIV today. We have come so far, but there is still a lot of work to do. We still need to fight the stigma, we still need to reduce the shame, and we need to support those living with HIV. And we need to remember that there is help and there is support out there.
And if you want help or to help, please consider supporting organisations like the Terence Higgins Trust or UNAIDS. You can also educate yourself, get tested, and challenge the stigma when you see it. And if anyone has been affected by anything we've discussed on this episode, we have posted the link to support networks and charities that have trained staff that can provide you with the appropriate help and support if you need it. These links will be in the description of this episode.
Thank you. And thanks for joining us on the Gaily Digest today. Let's keep talking about HIV and AIDS, and because awareness helps save lives. See you next time.